Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Andy sat motionless in the passenger seat, staring blankly at the ornate front door. His mind struggled to process the whirlwind of events that had led him to this moment. Just days ago, his life had been normal, or as normal as it could be for a recent college graduate trying to find his place in the world. Now, everything had changed in an instant. "Are you ready to go inside, dear?" The soft voice of his Aunt Babs broke through his reverie. Andy turned to look at her, taking in her kind eyes and the worry lines etched around her mouth. He managed a weak nod, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he spoke. Aunt Babs gave his hand a gentle squeeze before exiting the car. Andy took a deep breath, steeling himself, and followed suit. The gravel crunched under his feet as he made his way to the trunk to retrieve his hastily packed suitcase. The front door creaked open as they approached, revealing a grand entryway with a sweeping staircase. Andy's eyes widened slightly, taking in the opulent surroundings. It was a far cry from the modest apartment he'd shared with his parents. "Welcome to Rosewood Academy," Aunt Babs said, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I know it's not home, but I hope you'll be comfortable here." Andy nodded again, his throat tight. Home. The word brought a fresh wave of pain crashing over him. He blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. Aunt Babs seemed to sense his struggle. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, guiding him towards a cozy sitting room off to the side. "Why don't we have a cup of tea and talk things over?" The room was warm and inviting, with plush armchairs arranged around a crackling fireplace. Andy sank into one of the chairs, his body suddenly feeling heavy with exhaustion. Aunt Babs busied herself preparing tea, the familiar ritual providing a welcome distraction. As she handed him a steaming cup, Aunt Babs settled into the chair across from him. "I know this is all very overwhelming," she began gently. "Losing your parents so suddenly? I can't even imagine the pain you're going through." Andy stared into his tea, watching the swirling leaves as if they might provide some answers. I don't know what to do now," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Aunt Babs leaned forward, her expression earnest. "That's why I'm here, dear. You're not alone in this. We'll figure things out together." For the first time since the accident, Andy felt a tiny flicker of hope. He looked up, meeting his aunt's gaze. "Thank you," he said softly. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, sipping their tea. Finally, Aunt Babs set down her cup with a determined expression. "Now, there is something we need to discuss regarding your stay here." Andy tensed slightly, unsure of what to expect. "As you know, Rosewood is an all-girls boarding school," Aunt Babs explained. "Having a young man living on campus could cause complications." Andy's brow furrowed in confusion. "But where else can I go?" Aunt Babs held up a hand, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I have a proposition for you. It's a bit unorthodox, but hear me out." She leaned in conspiratorially. "What if for the duration of your stay here you were to pose as a girl?" Andy's jaw dropped. "What? You can't be serious. Just think about it." Aunt Babs pressed on. "It would allow you to stay here without raising any eyebrows. Plus, it might be a chance for you to step out of yourself for a while, to be someone else entirely." Andy shook his head, still struggling to process the idea. "But I don't know the first thing about being a girl. I'd never pull it off." Aunt Babs waved away his concerns. "Nonsense. With a little help from me, no one will suspect a thing. We'll get you some clothes, teach you the basics of makeup. It'll be like a grand adventure." Despite his initial shock, Andy found himself considering the proposition. The idea of pretending to be someone else, even for a little while, held a certain appeal. It would be a chance to escape the crushing weight of grief that had been suffocating him. I don't know," he said hesitantly. "It seems so crazy." Aunt Babs reached out, taking his hand in hers. I know it does, but sometimes in the face of tragedy, a little craziness is exactly what we need. What do you say? Will you give it a try? Andy took a deep breath, weighing his options. On one hand, the idea terrified him. On the other, what did he have to lose? All right, he said finally, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. I'll do it. Aunt Babs clapped her hands together in delight. Wonderful! Oh, we're going to have so much fun with this. Now, let's see about getting you some proper clothes. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Aunt Babs threw herself into the task of transforming Andy with gusto, raiding her own closet and that of her niece who had long since graduated. Andy found himself swept along in her enthusiasm, trying on skirts and blouses, learning to walk in heels, with many stumbles and near falls, and marveling at the way a simple change of clothing could alter his entire silhouette. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Aunt Babs stepped back to survey her handiwork. Andy stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing the person staring back at him. He wore a knee-length floral dress in soft pastels, cinched at the waist to create the illusion of curves. His legs, freshly shaved, an experience he hoped never to repeat, were clad in sheer stockings. On his feet were a pair of modest heels that he was only just learning to balance in. But it was his face that held his attention. Aunt Babs had worked magic with makeup, softening his features and emphasizing his naturally long lashes. His shaggy hair had been styled into a feminine bob, framing his face in a way that completely changed its character. Well, Aunt Babs prompted, her eyes shining with pride. What do you think? Andy turned from side to side, still marveling at his transformation.
I can't believe it,
he said softly. Is that really me? Aunt Babs came to stand beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders.
It most certainly is, my dear, though I suppose we should start thinking of a new name for you. We can't very well call you Andy while you're like this.
Andy considered for a moment. What about Andrea? It's close enough that I might remember to respond to it.
Andrea,
Aunt Babs repeated, nodding approvingly. I like it. Well then, Andrea, welcome to Rosewood Academy. I have a feeling you're going to fit right in. As they stood there, admiring his new look, a thought occurred to Andy, or Andrea, as he supposed he should start thinking of himself. Wait, what about my voice? Won't that give me away? Aunt Babs chuckled. Don't worry, dear, we'll work on that too. For now, just try speaking a bit softer and higher. Like this. She demonstrated, pitching her voice up slightly. Andrea cleared his throat and attempted to mimic her. Like this? The words came out in an awkward falsetto, causing them both to burst into laughter. Well, we'll keep practicing, Aunt Babs said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes. But that's enough for today. You must be exhausted. Let's get you settled into your room. She led Andrea up the grand staircase to the second floor, where a long hallway stretched out before them. This is the teacher's wing, Aunt Babs explained. You'll have a bit more privacy here than in the student dormitories. They stopped at a door near the end of the hall. Aunt Babs produced a key from her pocket and handed it to Andrea. This will be your home for the next little while. I hope you'll be comfortable here. Andrea turned the key in the lock, pushing open the door to reveal a cozy room with a large window overlooking the school grounds. A 4-poster bed dominated one wall, while a desk and wardrobe occupied the other. It was simple but charming, with floral wallpaper and lace curtains adding a feminine touch. It's lovely, Andrea said sincerely, taking in the space that would be his sanctuary. Aunt Babs beamed. I'm so glad you like it. Now, why don't you get some rest? We have a big day ahead of us tomorrow, your first day as a Rosewood girl. As the door closed behind her, Andrea sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up to him. He kicked off the uncomfortable heels with a sigh of relief, wiggling his toes. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, Andrea felt a strange sense of excitement bubbling up inside. This whole situation was utterly bizarre, but there was something oddly freeing about it. For a little while, at least, he could forget about the tragedy that had brought him here. He could be someone else entirely. With that thought, Andrea drifted off to sleep, still clad in his floral dress, dreaming of the adventures that awaited him in this new chapter of his life. The next morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the lace curtains and rousing Andrea from a deep sleep. For a moment, he lay there in confusion, trying to reconcile the unfamiliar surroundings with his memories. Then it all came flooding back. The accident, Aunt Babs, and the wild scheme they'd cooked up. Andrea sat up slowly, running a hand through his newly styled hair. It wasn't just a dream, after all. A soft knock at the door jolted him fully awake.
"Andrea, dear, are you up?"
Aunt Babs's voice called out.
"Yes, I'm awake,"
Andrea replied, wincing at how his natural voice contrasted with his feminine appearance. The door creaked open, and Aunt Babs bustled in, already impeccably dressed in a smart skirt suit. "Good morning. I hope you slept well. We have a busy day ahead of us." She laid out a neat pile of clothes on the bed, a white blouse, a pleated skirt in the school's navy blue, and various undergarments that made Andrea blush just looking at them. "Here's your uniform," Aunt Babs explained. "I'll leave you to get dressed. Remember, tuck and smooth everything carefully. When you're ready, come down to my office and we'll go over a few last-minute details before introducing you to the rest of the school." With that, she swept out of the room, leaving Andrea to stare at the uniform with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. Getting dressed proved to be more of a challenge than Andrea had anticipated. The various layers of the uniform were confusing, and he struggled with the unfamiliar fastenings. By the time he managed to get everything on correctly, he was flushed and slightly out of breath. He turned to the mirror, adjusting the skirt and smoothing down the blouse. The effect was startling. Gone was any trace of the young man he'd been just days ago. In his place stood a demure schoolgirl, ready for her first day of classes. Taking a deep breath, Andrea slipped on the prescribed shoes, thankfully flats rather than heels, and made his way down to Aunt Babs' office. He found her seated behind an imposing oak desk, glasses perched on her nose as she pored over some paperwork. She looked up as he entered, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Oh, don't you look lovely?" she exclaimed, coming around the desk to inspect him more closely. "You're a natural at this, my dear." Andrea felt his cheeks warm at the praise. "Thank you," he said softly, remembering to pitch his voice higher. "Though I'm not sure I feel very natural." Aunt Babs chuckled, patting his arm reassuringly.
"You'll get used to it, I promise. Now let's go over your backstory one more time."
They spent the next half hour refining the details of Andrea's fictional life. According to the story they'd concocted, she was Aunt Babs's niece from out of state, transferring to Rosewood mid-semester due to family circumstances. It was close enough to the truth that Andrea felt he could keep the details straight. As the clock approached 8, Aunt Babs stood, smoothing down her suit.
"Well, it's time to face the music. Are you ready to meet your new classmates?"
Andrea's stomach churned with nerves, but he nodded resolutely.
"As ready as I'll ever be, I suppose."
They made their way to the school's main assembly hall, where the students had already gathered for morning announcements. Andrea's heart pounded as they approached the doors, the muffled sounds of chatter growing louder with each step. Aunt Babs paused, turning to give him one last encouraging smile. "Remember, chin up, shoulders back. You can do this." With that, she pushed open the doors, and Andrea found himself facing a sea of curious faces. The chatter in the hall died down as Aunt Babs strode to the front, Andrea trailing behind her. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, assessing and judging. It took every ounce of willpower not to turn and flee. "Good morning, ladies," Aunt Babs addressed the assembly, her voice ringing out clear and authoritative. "I hope you all had a restful weekend. Before we begin our usual announcements, I have a special introduction to make." She gestured for Andrea to step forward. He did so on shaky legs, trying to remember everything they'd practiced about feminine posture and movement. "This is Andrea, my niece," Aunt Babs continued. "She'll be joining us here at Rosewood for the remainder of the semester. I trust you'll all make her feel welcome." A murmur of interest rippled through the crowd. Andrea forced a shy smile, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. To his relief, he saw mostly friendly curiosity rather than suspicion. "Andrea, would you like to say a few words?" Aunt Babs prompted gently. Panic flared in Andrea's chest. They hadn't prepared for this. But backing out now would only draw more attention. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "Hello," he began, cringing inwardly at how his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again, focusing on maintaining the higher pitch they'd practiced. "I'm very happy to be here at Rosewood. Thank you all for having me." It wasn't much, but it seemed to satisfy the crowd. As he stepped back, a smattering of polite applause filled the hall. The rest of the assembly passed in a blur. Andrea found himself ushered to a seat among the other students, hyper-aware of every movement he made. He was sure everyone must be staring at him, seeing through his flimsy disguise at any moment. But as the minutes ticked by and no one shouted, "Imposter!" Andrea began to relax slightly. Maybe, just maybe, they could pull this off after all. As the assembly concluded and the students began filing out to their first classes, a petite blonde girl approached Andrea with a friendly smile.
"Hi there."
"I'm Emma," she introduced herself. "I've been assigned to show you around today. What's your first class?" Andrea fumbled in his bag for his schedule, grateful for the distraction.
It looks like English literature with Mrs. Holloway?"
Emma's face lit up.
"Oh, perfect. That's my first class, too. Come on, I'll show you the way."
As they navigated the bustling hallways, Emma kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing out various classrooms and introducing Andrea to what felt like half the student body. It was overwhelming, but Andrea found himself grateful for Emma's outgoing nature. It made it easier to blend in, to let her take the lead in conversations. They arrived at the English classroom just as the bell rang. Mrs. Holloway, a stern-looking woman with salt and pepper hair, peered at Andrea over her glasses as they entered. "Ah, you must be our new student," she said. "Andrea, is it? Find an empty seat, please. We're about to begin." Andrea scanned the room, his heart sinking as he realized the only available seat was right at the front. Reluctantly, he made his way there, hyper-aware of the whispers and curious glances following him. As he settled into his seat, smoothing his skirt nervously, Mrs. Holloway addressed the class.
"We'll be continuing our discussion of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice today."
"Andrea, I trust you're familiar with the text?" Andrea nodded, silently thanking his literary-minded mother for insisting he read the classics.
"Yes, ma'am,"
he replied, remembering at the last second to soften his voice. Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow, looking faintly impressed. "Excellent. Perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on Elizabeth Bennet's character development throughout the novel?" Put on the spot, Andrea felt a moment of panic. But as he began to speak, he found the words flowing more easily than he'd expected. He'd always enjoyed analyzing literature, and it was a relief to focus on something other than maintaining his facade. As the class progressed, Andrea found himself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of academic discussion. He even ventured to raise his hand a few times, contributing to the debate about Austen's use of irony and social commentary. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Andrea was feeling considerably more confident. As the students filed out, Mrs. Holloway called him back. "I must say, Andrea, I'm impressed," she said, a hint of a smile softening her stern features.
"It's refreshing to have a new voice in our discussions. I look forward to hearing more from you in future classes."
Andrea felt a warm glow of pride at the praise. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I'm looking forward to it as well." As he left the classroom, he found Emma waiting for him in the hallway. "Wow, you really held your own in there," she exclaimed. Mrs. Holloway is usually pretty tough on new students, but she seemed to like you." Andrea shrugged modestly, but couldn't help feeling pleased.
"I've always enjoyed literature," he said.
"What's our next class?" The rest of the morning passed in a whirlwind of new faces, unfamiliar classrooms, and the constant underlying tension of maintaining his disguise. By the time lunch rolled around, Andrea was exhausted but exhilarated. He'd made it through half the day without anyone suspecting a thing. Emma led him to the dining hall, a grand room with long tables and high vaulted ceilings. The noise level rose dramatically as they entered, hundreds of girls chattering and laughing as they ate. "Come on, you can sit with us," Emma said, guiding him towards a table where a group of girls was already seated. As they approached, Andrea's steps faltered. This would be his biggest test yet, casual social interaction with his peers. What if he said the wrong thing? What if they noticed his Adam's apple, or the way he sat, or any of the million other things that could give him away? But it was too late to back out now. Emma was already making introductions. "Everyone, this is Andrea," she announced to the table. "Andrea, meet Olivia, Zoe, and Mia." The girls greeted him warmly, shifting to make room at the table. Andrea slid into a seat, trying to mimic the way the other girls perched delicately on the edge of their chairs. "So, Andrea," Olivia leaned in, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Tell us everything. Where are you from? Why did you transfer here in the middle of the semester?"
Andrea took a deep breath, calling to mind the backstory he and Aunt Babs had crafted. "I'm from California," he began, carefully modulating his voice. "My parents, they travel a lot for work. They thought it would be better for me to have a more stable environment for my studies." It wasn't entirely a lie, he reasoned. His parents had traveled frequently, before the accident. The thought sent a pang through his heart, but he pushed it aside, forcing himself to focus on the present.
"California?" Zoe's eyes widened. "That must be so different from here. Do you miss the beach?" Andrea nodded, warming to the fabrication. "Sometimes, but it's beautiful here too, in a different way. I'm looking forward to experiencing the change of seasons." The conversation flowed more easily after that, the girls peppering him with questions about his supposed life in California and sharing gossip about life at Rosewood. Andrea found himself relaxing, even enjoying the camaraderie. It was so different from his usual social interactions with other guys. As lunch drew to a close, Mia turned to Andrea with a conspiratorial grin. "So have you noticed any cute boys yet?" Andrea nearly choked on his water. Of all the questions he'd prepared for, this wasn't one of them. I haven't really been looking," he stammered. The girls erupted into giggles. "Oh, come on," Olivia teased. "There must be someone who's caught your eye. What about Mr. Edwards, the young history teacher? All the girls have a crush on him." Andrea felt his face heating up. How was he supposed to respond to this? He couldn't very well admit that he found the idea of crushing on a male teacher disturbing. Thankfully, Emma came to his rescue. "Leave her alone, guys. She's only been here half a day. Give her a chance to settle in before you start playing matchmaker." The others grumbled good-naturedly, but let the subject drop. As they gathered their things to head to afternoon classes, Andrea shot Emma a grateful look.
"Thanks for that,"
he murmured as they left the dining hall. Emma shrugged, giving him an understanding smile. "No problem. They can be a bit overwhelming sometimes, but they mean well." As they walked to their next class, Andrea found himself marveling at how quickly he'd been accepted into this close-knit group. It was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting to have allies in this strange new world, but terrifying to think how easily it could all come crashing down if his secret was discovered. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of new information and constant vigilance. By the time the final bell rang, Andrea was mentally and physically exhausted. The constant tension of maintaining his disguise, combined with the unfamiliarity of his clothing and the need to modulate his voice and mannerisms, had taken a toll. As the students streamed out of the classrooms, chattering excitedly about their plans for the evening. Andrea felt a wave of relief wash over him. He could finally retreat to the sanctuary of his room and drop the act, at least for a little while. But as he was about to slip away, Emma caught up with him. "Hey, Andrea, a bunch of us are going to hang out in the common room and watch a movie tonight. Want to join?" Andrea hesitated. The thought of extending this charade into the evening was daunting, but he knew that isolating himself would only raise suspicions. "Sure," he found himself saying. "That sounds fun. What time?" Emma beamed. "Great. We usually start around 8. I'll come knock on your door, okay?" As Andrea made his way back to his room in the teacher's wing, his mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he'd survived his first day without anyone discovering his secret. On the other, the constant need for vigilance was exhausting. He closed the door behind him with a sigh of relief, kicking off the uncomfortable shoes and flopping onto the bed. For a few blissful moments, he allowed himself to simply be, free from the constraints of his new identity. But all too soon, reality came crashing back. He still had homework to do, and he needed to prepare for the evening's social gathering. With a groan, Andrea hauled himself off the bed and settled at the desk. As he worked through his assignments, he found his mind wandering. Despite the stress and fear of discovery, there was something oddly liberating about this new life. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't consumed by grief. The constant need to maintain his disguise left little room for dwelling on his loss. A soft knock at the door startled him out of his reverie. "Andrea, it's Aunt Babs. May I come in? Just a second," Andrea called out, quickly adjusting his rumpled uniform. "Okay, come in." Aunt Babs entered, her face breaking into a wide smile as she saw him. "Well, how was your first day as a Rosewood girl?" Andrea couldn't help but smile back. "It was interesting," he admitted. "Exhausting, but not as terrifying as I thought it would be." Aunt Babs settled into the armchair by the window, her eyes twinkling. "I knew you could do it. I've been hearing nothing but good things about you all day. Mrs. Holloway was particularly impressed." A warm glow of pride suffused Andrea's chest. "Really? That's good to hear." "Indeed it is." Aunt Babs nodded approvingly. "Now, tell me all about it." "I want to hear everything." As Andrea recounted the events of the day, from the nerve-wracking assembly to the lunchtime gossip, Aunt Babs listened attentively, offering encouragement and advice. "It sounds like you're settling in wonderfully," she said when he'd finished. "I'm so proud of you, dear. I know this isn't easy, but you're handling it with grace." Andrea felt a lump form in his throat at her words. "Thank you," he said softly. "I couldn't do this without your help." Aunt Babs reached out, squeezing his hand affectionately. "That's what family is for. Now, I hear you have plans this evening." Andrea nodded, explaining about the movie night. "I'm not sure I'm up for more socializing," he admitted. "But I don't want to seem antisocial. I think it's a wonderful idea," Aunt Babs encouraged. "The more you interact with the other girls, the more natural your role will become. Just remember to be yourself. Well, your new self," she added with a wink. As 8 o'clock approached, Andrea found himself once again fussing with his appearance in front of the mirror. He'd changed into more casual clothes, a soft sweater and leggings that Aunt Babs had provided, but still felt self-conscious about every detail. A knock at the door signaled Emma's arrival. Taking a deep breath, Andrea opened the door, pasting on a smile. "Hi, Emma. I'm ready to go." Emma's eyes widened slightly as she took in Andrea's appearance. "Wow, cute outfit. Come on, everyone's already gathering in the common room." As they made their way down the hall, Andrea's nerves began to resurface. This would be his first truly casual interaction with the other girls. What if he slipped up? What if they noticed something off about him? But as they entered the common room, the warm atmosphere immediately put him at ease. The space was cozy with plush sofas and armchairs arranged around a large TV. girls were sprawled across the furniture, chatting and laughing as they prepared for the movie. "Andrea, over here!" Olivia waved from one of the sofas. "We saved you a spot." As Andrea settled in between Olivia and Zoe, he felt a strange sense of belonging wash over him. For the first time in what felt like ages, he wasn't thinking about his grief or his deception. He was just present. The movie started, some romantic comedy that Andrea would never have chosen to watch on his own. But as the night wore on, filled with laughter, commentary, and shared snacks, he found himself genuinely enjoying the experience. It was a side of female friendships he'd never been privy to before. The easy camaraderie, the inside jokes, the way they supported and uplifted each other. As an only child raised primarily by his father, it was a revelation. As the credits rolled and the girls began to disperse for the night, Andrea felt a pang of sadness. He didn't want this feeling of connection to end. "Same time next week?" Mia asked as they cleaned up the snack wrappers. "Definitely," Emma agreed enthusiastically. "Andrea, you'll join us again, right?" Andrea nodded, surprising himself with his eagerness. "I'd love to." As he made his way back to his room, Andrea's mind was whirling. This experience was turning out to be so much more than just a convenient disguise. It was opening his eyes to a whole new way of relating to others, of understanding himself. For the first time since the accident, as he drifted off to sleep that night, Andrea felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Whatever came next, he knew he was stronger and more resilient than he'd ever given himself credit for. The days began to blur together as Andrea settled into his new routine at Rosewood. Each morning brought a fresh challenge, perfecting his makeup, remembering to sit and walk like a lady, pitching his voice just right. But with each passing day, these tasks became more natural, requiring less conscious effort. In class, Andrea found himself thriving, free from the expectations and stereotypes that had always surrounded him as a male student. He discovered a new confidence in his academic abilities. He began to participate more actively in discussions, his unique perspective often earning praise from his teachers. Mrs. Holloway, in particular, seemed to have taken him under her wing. After one particularly spirited debate about the feminist themes in Virginia Woolf's works, she held Andrea back after class. "You have a remarkable insight into these texts," she said, her usually stern expression softened by approval. "Have you considered pursuing literature at a higher level?" Andrea felt a warm glow of pride at her words. I hadn't really thought about it," he admitted. It was true. Before the accident, he'd been vaguely planning to follow in his father's footsteps and study business. But now, the idea of immersing himself in books and ideas held a new appeal. Mrs. Holloway nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you should. You have a gift, Andrea. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." As he left the classroom, Andrea's mind was buzzing with possibilities. For the first time since arriving at Rosewood, he found himself thinking beyond the immediate future, beyond just maintaining his disguise. Could this experience be shaping his actual future? But it wasn't just academically that Andrea was flourishing. Socially, he found himself integrated into a close-knit group of friends with Emma, Olivia, Zoe, and Mia at its core. Their weekly movie nights had become a highlight of his routine, a time when he could truly relax and just be himself, or rather, his new self. One evening, as they were sprawled across the common room sofas watching a tearjerker romance, Andrea found himself swept up in the emotion of the movie. As the star-crossed lovers shared a final, heart-wrenching goodbye, he felt tears welling up in his eyes. For a moment, panic flared in his chest. He'd never been comfortable showing this kind of emotion before, but as he glanced around, he saw that all the other girls were similarly affected, sniffling and dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Olivia, noticing his tears, simply handed him a tissue with a watery smile. There was no judgment, no teasing, just simple acceptance and shared emotion. It was a revelation. For the first time, Andrea felt truly free to express his feelings without fear of ridicule or questioning of his masculinity. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of pent-up emotion. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.